Hello and happy Age Diversity Day. Thank you for attending today's conference. My name is Paul Owen and I'm proud to be today's chair. I'm the Operations Director of the Age Diversity Forum, having previously held several roles, most notably as CEO of British Canoeing and CEO of the German School in London. At British Canoeing, I undertook a major overhaul of the organisation, resulting in significant changes, producing increased growth in performance, both in production of Olympic medals and the increase to active membership, both for elite performers and recreational canoeists. To put it in business terms, I developed a multi-million-pound organisation from zero to become one of Britain's most successful sports. I'm particularly proud of my work in diversity, delivering the sports Paralympic programme, culminating in the inclusion in the 2016 Rio Olympics, and now looking forward to 2021, when it will be one of the strongest programmes in the Tokyo Games. Before I introduce my fellow panelists, can I ask the delegates to perhaps introduce themselves via the chat facility? It would be nice to know who's online. And also, I've got colleagues online who would be pleased to answer any questions about the Age Diversity Forum. So my fellow panelists, if I can ask them to introduce themselves. Ali.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ali. I am a managing director of Hansuke. Hansuke is a boutique advisory firm, and it's where we live our values every day. Now, importantly, I'm actually honored to, well, as a firm, we are honored to be champion members of Age Diversity Forum. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I grew up in the early 80s when there was open hostility and casual racism was just part and parcel of the culture. You can just watch some of the programs from that decade. So I know firsthand what it's like to be made to feel excluded, and that's why I'm here today, so that we can do the right thing together. Thank you.
Shaheen.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Shaheen Akram. I'm really pleased to be on this call and this conversation. Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at ING, within the financial sector, within banking. I have extensive experience in the D&I space and have had the fortune of working in some really diverse industries, including manufacturing, pharma, the financial sector, even the not-for-profit sector, and also in the space of consulting. So I hope what that does is gives me a depth and breadth of the issues which unfortunately are, exist. They're pretty much similar issues. It's just how you tackle them and go about dealing with them that I think makes the difference. So I'm really pleased to be amongst my fellow esteemed speakers and look forward to this conversation.
So that just leaves me. I'm Neil Milliken. I'm Global Head of Accessibility at Atos. I've been responsible for standing up all of our diversity networks in the UK, and was particularly passionate as an organisation that has 5 generations in the workforce to make sure that we include all of them. I've been working on and off with Steve, who is one of the founders of Age Diversity Forum, for a number of years, particularly focused on the work that we're doing together as part of the Diversity and Inclusion Board for the Institute of Coding. So I'm particularly interested at the intersection of age and ability and disability, and those things are certainly not mutually exclusive. So glad to be with you.
Thank you. So just a reminder of our title today for our seminar. As society adapts, our business looks to reboot from COVID-19, we will need to redefine how organisations operate to stay agile and respond to changing needs. Comprehensive research demonstrates that a diverse workforce creates the strongest organisations. And from my own experience, creating a diverse workforce was key to our organisation's success. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank Hansuke as an ADF champion for helping to bring this event together. It's a good example of how we work with our champions. Perhaps before we start, maybe a poll to kick things off. And I'd like to pose the question to you, is age diversity part of your organisation's key values? Whilst you ponder that, perhaps a question to our panelists to get things started. Maybe you would like to take this one, Ali. What will the new normal look like, and how do we see age as part of that agenda?
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Can you hear me properly? Hi, I was just unmuting myself. Well, it's a really interesting question, Paul. I mean, until a month ago, I mean, we were in a very, very different place, and the discussion was very different at that time. So I think there is something quite radical taking place. All I can say is that I think the direction of travel is really positive. There is, one of the issues that I think we find is that age diversity perhaps does not get as much attention as it should. But, what I see around me is that there's so much need for talent. There's so much need for experience and knowledge that often organizations have just simply allowed to walk out of the door. And that capital asset, firms need to really capitalize on and not, let dissipate. And I'm afraid, there's no other way to put it. And I think there is a bit of we have to acknowledge that there is age discrimination and age stereotypes exist. And importantly, they're domain specific. There's enough academic literature that shows that there are different attitudes towards older workers. Lots of East-West comparisons. And coming from a Eastern background, we tend to put a lot of store by the wisdom and experience that our seniors have. And I'm pleased that, we apply this at Hansuke. We have built the firm on the shoulders of experienced wise heads, with appropriate support, both energy and enthusiasm from the young. But I think, as these global shifts are taking place, I think there will be definitely a lot more look at what models are working in the East. And I think it will become a business issue. So I do see a positive outlook.
Thank you. Shaheen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that, Paul. So I think that, what's the new normal and where does age diversity play a part in that? I think that all the current activity externally that's been taking place that has pushed again the conversation and agenda of DNI back in front of us, really. And I think that's a brilliant and great opportunity for us to rethink again about our plans and our strategies that we have as organizations. Just think, what else can we do, how else can we strengthen, and so on. So I think it gives us that great impetus. The second thing is that, where I am at ING, part of our global D&I strategy, and ING is an organisation that's about 55,000 people worldwide. Part of our global strategy does include that of age groups. So we have diversity inclusion is important to us from the widest perspective. But if we're going to put some focus and measure some of our activities or track, we look at three areas, which is gender, nationality, and age, the age dimension. And that's age or generations across the spectrum. So it's not just looking at one end or the older end or the younger end. It's really driving towards building an organization based on mixed teams. That's our kind of ambition, that we have mixed teams and that we have an inclusive organization. So it is part of our thinking and part of our ambitions.
Okay, and I think Neil, it'd be interesting to see what you have to say on the subject.
Yeah, I think there's. Oh, I'll wait for you to mute. Thank you. I think there's real opportunity coming out of the crisis that we've been in, because there is a change in the attitudes to flexibility of work. We are still going to face the biases for quite some time to come, but I think that the fact is that a lot of people want to work in different ways, and the crisis has forced organizations to accept that, because there needs to be flexibility in order for them to continue to function. So essentially, we've removed the excuse for not being inclusive. Fully support all of the things that have been said already about the organizational memory that is held in the brains of older employees, the experience, the wealth of prior decisions and knowledge, and all of this stuff is super important. And we've also, I see in the audience, I'm going to call out to Denise, my colleague, who is our global diversity and inclusion officer, because we've got a couple of networks. One is the Aon network, which is essentially a network which focuses on all of the generations, and we've also got a 10+ network, which again looks at tenure in service rather than age specifically. So you could join the company at 18 and be a member at 28. The focus really is about making sure that we talk across the generations, and that we value each other's contributions. And so some of the other things we're doing are things like reverse mentoring, and making sure that we can learn from each other, because we all have things that we can teach each other.
Lovely, thank you. Well, we have a question from Keith, who's one of our delegates today, and it's how to capitalize on age asset when bias is entrenched. Ali.
Sure. I think. Sorry, is this better? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
we can.
Great. Sorry. Yeah. So it's about actually the practical strategies that a firm needs to develop, and with all cultural things, it's the tone is right. Is set at the top. So that to me is the number one thing. If there is a positive culture that you inculcate, that basically sets everything in motion. And one of the things that I don't make any bones about it is, if you look at the people at Hansuke, they're all people. The senior guys are people who were holding very senior positions in organizations like HMRC or the Institute of Chartered Accountants, who got to a certain point, after which they decided to pursue other interests in life, which is absolutely fine. And I reached out to them and they came on board. So the respect that I, as the leader of my organization, give these people the experience, that's the number one thing. So it's getting the culture right. The second thing is sharing that, the culture, the respect I have for them with my other colleagues. So they start appreciating that this is really worthwhile, the thing that we're doing with them. And also sort of like the final thing, and I just build on Neil's point, is around having putting in place flexible arrangements whereby these senior people can work with you on their terms. So there's one gentleman who loves going on cruises around the world. So I said, that's absolutely fine, Chris, if that's what you want to do. But surely it can't be that difficult to send me an email. So all I'm going to do is generate reports or whatever it is, and periodically send them across for you to review. And he said that works absolutely fine with me. So do you see, it's about working around them and fitting into their agenda because you value the knowledge that they have. That's my message.
I see a question that has just come up in the chat window, which from Lawrence Rose, which I think is really interesting, and that is not current reality better than new normal? And I think that that's a valid point as well, because what we're in right now, we're not working from home, we're coping from home in the midst of a crisis, and I think that we get an opportunity right now to shape what the new normal might look like, but I don't think we're in it yet. So I think it's for us to advocate inclusiveness, and I think it's for us to help our leadership build the right kinds of new structures, etc., and see and to paint the benefits, and to find ways of working that are going to enable us to retain that talent, and some of that may be through like internal gig economies in organizations, etc. But we're certainly not in normality yet.
So an opportunity for us to kind of redefine the future and perhaps take some new things forward, some new thinking to help us make stronger organizations.
Absolutely.
Shaheen. Sorry, Neil.
I was just going to say, absolutely, yes, it's an opportunity that we need to grasp, and it's there's nothing quite like a good crisis for changing society, and business is part of society, and we ought not to forget that business has a role to play in society. So I think it's going to be an interesting time.
If I can just interject, I think it's quite interesting, Neil, just on that point. There are not two issues taking place, but sorry, not one, but two issues taking place. There's obviously sort of like the C-19, but I think the BLM movement, I mean, what started off as a, sort of like a killing of a black man in America has become much bigger now. And I think that tide is going to be a very interesting one where that gets to.
I think so. I think that if I can just interject here, clearly there's a number of external factors that are pushing organizations to think again. And as I said before, review, their thinking, their approach, their strategy, and their plans around this. What needs to be strengthened, what needs to be thrown out, what needs to be brought back in, and so on, which I think is again, a great opportunity for us to utilize in the work that we do at the levels that we operate at. I think in terms of driving the D&I agenda, for me, in my experience, there's probably three things that you need to do. One is this has to be led by the top of the house. That is really sometimes one of the tough things to do, but that's what you have to do. This has to be driven from the top. The top has to understand how this impacts not only their business, but also how this is the right thing to do on many different fronts. So that's step one. How do they set this up? What's their expectation around this? And that is informed by internal and external information. The second piece is always know where your starting line is. What's your baseline? Where are you operating from? Be very honest with yourself as an organization. How good are we at this? Are we even on the page when it comes to working in the space of diversity and inclusion? So know your baseline. And then thirdly, set your aspiration. Where do you want to get to? What is your ambition around this? And then you plot your journey and off you go. And as part of that has to be the accountability. It's just not good enough to say this is what we want to do and this is how we're going to get there if we don't have the regular check-ins that we always have when it comes to driving any other kind of business activity. We want to know how we're doing. We want to know how many customers we're growing by, or how much our business is growing by. And in vain, for this to give it the level of importance and attention, it has to have the same approach. Otherwise, it will just be you know, the DNI practitioners in the corner over there with the odd leader that's very supportive, you know, making the noise around DNI. It has to be integrated and embedded.
Lovely, thank you. Can I just check that you can actually hear me, because I'm being tipped off that maybe that I'm not I sound like I've been muted when I'm not.
I can hear you.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so perhaps a question from myself. Why is it that corporate diversity and inclusion programs are not very inclusive of the age agenda?
May I?
Neil, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think because actually diversity and inclusion programs in general have usually started from employee advocacy, or a lot of times have been. A lot of them have grown up from the grassroots, and as a result of that, sometimes they become a little bit one-dimensional, because the people that started whichever program was the catalyst in that particular organization doesn't necessarily think about age. And actually what we need to be thinking about is intersectionality, because we've already heard from Ali about the fact that we've got multiple issues going on here, but diversity is multifaceted too. So whilst I am a white male wasp, 6'2", but I'm also at the intersection of disability. So I mean, I have a hidden condition. So these things are more complex. So I think as organizations start to recognize some of these complexities, then we start to recognize that age is part of that diversity picture, as is culture, as is disability. But there has tended to be a focus on gender and ethnicity because they were issues that companies were obviously failing on. So so I think that sometimes the people have been championing those first. Doesn't mean that the other issues don't have validity. I fully support that they do, but I think that has been perhaps one of the historic reasons why we haven't focused on it more as organisations.
Ali, do you have any thoughts in that area?
Sorry, I just unmuted myself. Yes, I do. I mean, sort of like a part of me is almost sort of like I find it mentally challenging as to why would we even be talking about this, because the commercial rationale is so overwhelming in my mind that it doesn't actually need very much to sort of like it's the imperative is so strong, just get it done. You with me? But the reality is it is overlooked, and it was quite interesting last week. I think I signed a new pay gap poll, which was about minorities. So it's quite interesting. So you get the gender sort of like diversity as the top of the list, then you get into the minorities, and then if you're lucky, it might go on to age. And I think it needs to be embraced fully. It's quite interesting what Shaheen's been saying is how they've sort of like put that as a key part of the three-pronged strategy. They put age right up there. I think if organizations haven't done it, they should do it straight away for the commercial reasons. Now, the odd thing is that there is legislative support for this. There is an Age Discrimination Act. So, firms need to be compliant and ensure that they are legally meeting their requirements. So I think until we get to sort of like these blind CVs and things like that, and they really become the norm, you're not going to move forward.
Shaheen, do you have any kind of words of wisdom on that subject?
Words of wisdom. I'll again pull through from my experience. I think that to Ali's point, you know, the whole piece around compliance, and in countries where there is legislation around age discrimination, so in the UK there is, you know, the way I see it, it's like a again, the baseline as an organization to have the license to operate, right? As a minimum, you know, organizations should be complying to any sort of discrimination legislation there is, number one. And then even if there isn't discrimination legislation in place, this then starts to talk to an organization's values and behaviors, and what is acceptable and unacceptable, as more and more so corporates and organizations are, you know, there to, you know, to kind of stand in society and say this is where we are on a variety of subjects, including diversity and inclusion. And sometimes it's not easy, sometimes it's not comfortable, but there's, you know, enough pressure with, you know, small p, whether that's legislation, whether that's expectations of customers or employees, whether that's even the demographic changes that Europe, for example, is having around the age demographics. These are all aspects that, you know, we need to kind of take into account. And, you know, one of the things that I found is that age is the subject of age, I have found it pulls in many more people to the diversity agenda than maybe some of the other strands, because it's almost like it's irrelevant of your gender, your nationality, your race, your sexual orientation. It's kind of everybody has an age, and they can all be found on an age spectrum. So for me, it's almost like the one that invites many to this conversation, which is often difficult to do, to get a wide spread of people coming to this conversation.
Can I just ask Shaheen something? I know you work in a bank, and if I may just borrow something for another part of the compliance program that banks have, is, say, for example, suspicious transaction reporting or AML KYC. Now, when the regulators found that these type of issues were prevalent and banks weren't doing anything about it, they started measuring, you know, how many cases were being recorded. And if they weren't being recorded, there was something clearly wrong with that culture. So under the sort of like the Equalities Act, you've got the mechanism for complaints, you know, where people have been sort of like. Now, I have a question, which is, I don't think that there is enough noise or enough education or training available to people, or we're not talking about society, letting people know what their rights are. And if people within organizations understood those ideas of citizenship within the organization, and then they knew that they had a recourse. So for example, every new applicant applying for a job, it should be made told to them that you have this right of complaint. You know, every bonus round, every promotion round, people should be told they have a right to complain, so they know that they can, there is an avenue. And if firms do not tell, or there isn't enough complaints coming in, then there's something wrong with the culture.
Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, so I could answer this in a number of ways, and I think one of the ways I will answer it is that you know, organizations have values, belief systems, codes that they operate by. And I'll just cite one, which is the Global Code of Conduct. And, you know, we're about, like I said before, about 55,000 people. And, you know, you want to make sure that on a regular, there's a regular beat around conversations around DNI, or knowing where people can be pointed to. We have something called the Global Code of Conduct. And, you know, that has 12 principles, and two of them, you know, speak directly to the space of diversity and inclusion. One's around safety, you know, being safe in an organization, and the other one's around speaking up, you know, encouraging people to speak up and speak out where they see behavior that is, you know, not conducive to what they would expect from an organization. So there are mechanisms there in place, and, you know, we do talk about them, refer to them. But as always, you know, this stuff, you can't do enough of it. It's a continuous beat that organizations need to kind of have and make. It's never ending.
So, okay, so why do we let experienced people go?
I think sometimes because there are conflicting pulls within an organization, where younger people are considered to be cheaper, and that where we are driven by markets alone. So as I put in the comments, a cost-driven culture rather than one that is driven by value. And I'm not just talking about our values as individuals and as managers, but I'm talking about cultures within organizations that look really not at what something costs right now, but what are the outcomes and those kind of values. And I think that when you're driven by markets, that there is a tendency to look at short-term, looking at how you can meet the expectations that you set for markets. And sometimes that means that decisions are made that are very short-term, and those include staffing decisions and work, employee profiling decisions. I also think that globalization has played a role in some of this, because as large organizations have offshored and outsourced people, we've lost a lot of older workers in the process, because it's not just the people that have been incumbent in those roles get lost from the organization as those jobs go to a different country, because most people don't want to move, even if they're given if they're given the choice. So there's some of that going on.
Shaheen, we've got a question from one of our delegates, from Lindsay Reed. Is ageism more important than any of the other 9 protected characteristics?
Thanks, Lindsay, for that question. This thing about which one's more important, which one's less important, this kind of thinking sometimes, if I'm being really honest with you, is not how we should be looking at this. Because when you look at an organization, and I'm going to take an example of, we have things called employee resource groups or employee networks, and often they are set up based on a group of people coming together to drive a particular focus on a particular part of diversity. So it could be age, it could be race, it could be gender, it could be LGBT, whatever. And what we're trying to do is, there's no one is at the top or the bottom of the list. They have equal importance. But what often happens is, when you have to start to prioritize from a point of view, where's the biggest issue, what do we need to put our focus on, or where's the biggest opportunity, what do we need to put the focus on, or what is it as a minimum we need to comply to, where do we need to put our focus on. So sometimes that is the approach that one takes, but honestly, one is no better than the other one, or more important or less important than the other. It's, if you think about it, in our own day-to-day lives, when there's so much to do, how do you start to put your day in order of kind of what needs to be dealt with first? And we're constantly looking and reviewing where to put attention, when to put attention, and so on. But really, no one trumps one more than the other, in my view.
I mean, may I come in, Paul?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I think it gets to the heart of what ageism is about. And sort of like, I note that Keith just mentioned something where he said, society, you worship youth, and I think there are both personal biases. So there's personal ageism, if you could call it, and then there is institutional or societal sort of like ageism. And you're not going to be able to fix all of them. I think, first of all, it starts with individually educating ourselves, particularly in sort of like, with the current trend that you've had in the last few years, the growth of the startups. So, this is sort of like, the kind of guys who are basically, hanging out in, sort of like in Shoreditch. And that's all about youth and how it's being portrayed. So I think there is that personal thing. And if we need to go back to that and basically start working very slowly within society and attaching value to age, wisdom, and knowledge. So I think that's at a personal level. But I think, with all of these things, you need role models, you need champions. And that's why I love the term that you guys have used, about having champions. And that has to come in at the institutional level. The leaders, as we said, earlier on, we were talking about, that must be fixed. And until we start talking about it, I remember a couple of years ago when the Liberal Party was being run by Ming Campbell. There was all these questions about health and so on. He's one of the sharpest, brightest minds that I've seen in politics, in my generation. And yet there were silly reasons being raised. So I think it's that type of sort of like moving the dialogue onto what really matters. So I think that's really what, at least to me, needs to be fixed.
Okay, so what barriers do organisations face in employing older workers? Neil.
Oh, okay. So I think that there may be a number. From my particular lens of disability and accessibility, they're concerned about health and cost of making adjustments, when we've got the data to show that the cost of making adjustments is really small, and that actually people who have disabilities are less likely to take time off than those that don't, and more likely to stay. Age and disability are interrelated. We tend to acquire disabilities as we get older, and in fact, if you live to be, in your 80s, you're likely, highly likely to have acquired at least one. So whilst some of us are born with them, the average age at which people start to acquire them is 57. And most people are working for at least another decade. There's a myth that disability makes you unable to work. It's not true. There are lots of talent amongst the overlapping communities. There is this innate ageism, the sort of fantasy of youth. The digital natives myth is another one. We're in a digital age. Everyone needs to be digital. Everyone needs to, that was born doing this stuff is innately comfortable. That's not true. Actually, there are a lot of people who are younger that are uncomfortable with the pace of change and uncomfortable with the tech. So I think there is broad societal perceptions that need to change, and that we do need some of these role models to show that age isn't necessarily the barrier to success or innovation. And I think that someone's just put in the window, bright young people. Well, actually, we want bright people of any age, and we should be looking at how we can encourage people to apply. And I think flexibility is one way, because actually, the more we can give people flexibility and flexible working, the more likely we are to attract that sort of diverse talent pool, whether it be people who are older and maybe don't want to do quite as much. And in France, we have this area where we actually reduce hours, as so there's a period where you can reduce your hours year by year, or days year by year for a number of years, so that you end up having a sort of phased retirement plan. Now, not that everyone wants to retire, but you've got that choice of changing life. I've watched people that have been really, really busy for most of their working lives also retire and die, because there's that whole thing of suddenly if all you've done all your life is work, then you stop working, you don't have any purpose anymore. So I think we need to re-examine the whole way that we deliver working experiences, and I think that some of the sort of portfolio jobs and sort of people give the gig economy a bad name. There has been exploitation, but there is also the opportunity to look at ways that we can engage people much more flexibly and engage them on their skills and their topics. And so I think some of it is in job design. Some of the actual structure of the way that we design jobs is stopping us from employing older people.
Thank you. Shaheen, what about in the world of ING?
I think the question was around different ages in the workplace and focusing on the at the older end. I think, for me, this age is another aspect that, we all have biases, we all have stereotypes, so we need to kind of accept that, number one. And number two, what do we do around this? How do we actively challenge some of the stereotypes, some of the words, some of the ways people might refer to, the young bright spark or the older, more experienced person, which one carries more weight? And I think that, that's the challenge we have, right? That we ourselves have to think about our own biases, because not everybody young is a bright spark and not everybody old is not a bright spark. So it doesn't really, for me, it doesn't really compute. And, we have to challenge each other on a daily basis to not only think about how we think about people, but also the way we describe people. And, when you look at some of the data points, in Europe, we have an aging workforce and a profile. So that is definitely out there. And we as employers need to kind of think about that, number one. Equally, you have a younger workforce as well. So the aim of the game is to can you make sure there's space for the mix? And that's the important piece, because we can all contribute, but what's the right contribution at the right time, which allows people to take the flexible approach to life that they wish, whatever that is, whether you're a new person in a new role that wants to work differently versus somebody in the middle or somebody at the other end. So it really is about tackling the biases we all carry, challenging the conversations we hear in the workforce and the workplace, and really finding, the other point was really finding, I don't really like to use the word role models. I prefer to use the word real models, because real models are those people that should be able to explain to you and share with you the good and the not so great questions, challenges, decisions they had to make to kind of move on their journey. And role models for me kind of, I think, gloss over the hard stuff, and we should hear more of the real modeling that has to happen.
Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of commentary about training and the value of training older people against younger people. There seems to be a bit of a thread moving through the chat. I've always been told that actually a younger person, when trained, might stay with a company for a couple of years, whereas an older person, say in their early 50s, might well stay for another 6, 7, 8 years. So I would like to see if the panel's got any views about the training and whether actually training older people is a myth or whether that is actually a real barrier. Neil? Sorry, Ali, did you want to come in?
Sure. I think it depends which industry you're in. So you take the kind of profession I'm in, which is tax law. It's actually based on your experience. So you're picking up that cumulative knowledge. So it's actually, you value the other end of the scale, if you know what I mean. So it's not just about the new stuff, it's about contextualizing the new stuff by reference to the historical developments. So I think that lends itself a bit better for people with experience. So that's one thing. If I can just say one thing, which is the barriers that was being discussed earlier on to do with training. I think there are some really big, societal changes that are taking place. One is just sort of like the baby boomers are on the cusp of this thing. So it may not be training, but a different way of working. I mean, we're already going to see that. I mean, the offshoring that we talked about earlier on, the globalization shifts, they have already taken shape, and they're going to almost been precipitated by what's happened now. So I think sort of like both organizations and individuals will have to adjust to a new working agenda. So I think, whether it's formal training or a mental shift towards a new way of working, I think that's definitely on the cards.
Thank you. Neil, I think you were perhaps about to say something.
It was just around the sort of expectations around training, because I think that we see within our own organization that the expectations that you set out at the beginning quite often then have an effect on tenure. So for example, our graduates, who we set high expectations for, tend to stay for less time than our apprentices. And that length of tenure for apprentices is really good for us. And apprentices can also come from lots of different age groups. So something that a lot of organizations don't realize is that apprenticeships are open not just to school leavers, but to anyone that wants to maybe change direction in their career. And because it's maybe on the job learning, and maybe they've not got the expectations set that they're going to be CEO within 5 years, their expectations are somewhat more that they're met by reality. Because I think that quite often, not just within our own organization, but within lots of organizations, apprenticeship programs are more realistic than the graduate programs, because a lot of graduate programs, you do the milk round, you tell everyone how wonderful the company is, how they're going to be the next leader, and sometimes reality doesn't match, and so they end up jumping ship to another organization. And I think that you want that length of tenure, because actually, whilst certain things move quickly, other things take time, and if you continually chopping and changing, then that's really bad for your organization and also for your customers, because you lose all of that knowledge. You're often restarting all over again every time you drop someone new in. So I think length of tenure is really important. You want to encourage people to stay, not just because it saves you money on recruitment.
Thank you. We have a question from Antonio Santos. How can we better connect generations within the startup ecosystem? Shaheen, I think that's one for you.
I was going to say, startups. I'm not sure I could really comment on that, but I think the general rules or principles apply, right? I mean, there's a stereotype that startups are run by young people. If you think of the likes of, I don't know, Facebook as an example, it was an organization that was set up by university graduates, but actually as an organization it's grown, it's brought in a variety of people, but still has a lot of work to do to bring in the diversity that it wants and aspires to. So I think that it's less about, it has to be less about your age and your gender and stuff like that, and it's a constant reminder to us that when we are recruiting, when we are hiring, when we are setting up, what are the skills and attributes that we are looking for? What's the experience that we're looking for, regardless of how many years it's taken to get that experience? And I think that kind of objectivity that we must have as a discipline is what we have to keep going back to, which is we're hiring, we're setting up, we're putting in new teams. How objective are we? And we allow each other to challenge each other when we come to those decisions. And that's not easy. That's quite a tough thing to do. But, you know, if the ultimate aim is the same and the intention is the same, which is to get the right and the best people for the work that needs to be done, then we have to facilitate that challenge amongst ourselves and be absolutely clear that this is about objective hiring, objective decision making, and be as transparent as you can be. And again, these are not easy things to do, but you know, we need to hold each other account on that.
Can I come in, Paul, with that?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, first of all, Antonio. I mean, I've been grappling with this myself and thinking about how do you fix something like that. And it is to do with society and attitudes. And quite often, you know, to me, it's less about the tenure talent, the phrase Denise has coined. It's actually about helping others to understand and appreciate and value people with that experience. And you do that by removing the threat. So it's quite often sort of like, you know, people will say, well, you know, you don't want to talk to him, he's dead wood and so on. Are you with me? And that has negative connotations. It may sort of like, if I can say, the younger generation may feel in a startup situation that they're being held down. So if we reframe that and sort of like turn each other into coaches, which a startup type of operation will lend itself a bit better to because it's less hierarchical. And it works both ways. So someone with a bit more tenure can basically coach, you know, someone who's coming in, you know, starting, and vice versa. I think it's about changing those relationships. That's going to be a key part of that ecosystem, Antonio.
Okay, thank you. Keith Tate comes in with a very telling question. Why is it that in talks like this, we are all saying what we are saying makes sense, but when being recruited by HR in many organizations, there is an obvious age bias? Neil.
I think actually it's not HR that are doing the recruiting. HR are only the channel through which people are recruited. So we've actually got to look further. We've got to look at the age bias in our general employee manager population, because whilst there may be some filter going on, a lot of that for the first sort of sift of candidates, maybe through the recruitment in HR, actually some of this is driven by the individual hiring managers. And then it also goes back to the whole cost versus value thing, because sometimes, unfortunately, you know, we're looking at cost and we assume that older workers are going to be more costly.
Shaheen, do you have any thoughts about that as sort of an organisation which must be recruiting a lot of people?
I think I think for me it goes back to especially when you're talking about recruitment, it's what's the ask or job description or skills and experiences that HR as probably the starting point have been asked to go and seek out. So, you know, if that includes something like they have to have an age profile between X and Y, then, you know, one has to ask, well, what's that got to do with the ability to do the role? And I've not seen anything like that in my time. When I worked abroad, when I worked with some companies or within countries in some of the Latin American states, it was quite clear about being able to stipulate, this was some years ago, being able to stipulate what somebody might look like and what their age profile might be. But here in more recently, I've not seen anything like that at all. I think we really have to go back to what's, being clear about our expectations of the ability of the role. What are we looking for in the role, and holding ourselves to that. I keep saying this is not easy. We've all got biases. They all leak in, whether it's at HR level or the hiring manager or, panels that you might have. And that's why that process of hiring, you've got to try and inject diversity of those people involved as much as possible. To try and eliminate or mitigate against some of that bias that is inevitably going to creep in. So you've got to do your very best there. And I think, this doesn't happen naturally. Naturally, we're not going to debias something. We have to take a proactive approach and, build this into the process.
Okay. Just picking up on something you said earlier, Ali, when you talked about your particular business sector. Do you think age diversity is linked to any particular sector, for example, retail or banking?
I think the international businesses generally, this is just, I haven't got research or anything to substantiate. My sense is that when you're looking at international businesses, they probably have less bias. I know that your CEO, Steve, I think he spent some time in Japan as well. And the more east you go, I think there is a less of an issue. You would give honorary positions to people with experience. So I think there is that side of things. And I completely agree that I think those businesses that rely on history as framing their offering, they will naturally tend to want to retain people. But then again, that's where the culture can sometimes trump the business commercial need, because, and maybe this is the point that Neil was making about the cost thing. Every year you see a whole host of people, say from HMRC or government departments, just leaving stock and barrel, which to me just does not make sense. So I think, attitudes in society will take time to change, and that's where the legislative measures need to have a bit more teeth to it.
Okay. We've got a comment from Lindsay Reed, which says, surely the key questions are, can you do the job? Will you turn up? Can we afford you? Will you stay in long enough for us to get some value out of the time you're here? There are no more jobs for life or even careers for life. Cynically, loyalty is sold, not always bought. Neil, I wonder if you have any sort of views about that remark.
I think that they're good questions, because ultimately what we want is someone that can do the job. And often people consciously or unconsciously, sometimes consciously, go into the interviews already having made up their mind who they're going to appoint. And we do have within our own organization, we've got 110,000 people, we do have training and structure about how to conduct interviews fairly, and how to try and remove prejudice and everything else. But we have to acknowledge that it still exists, and we have to still, work out how we can show people that they're taking decisions that are, bad for their own teams. Because ultimately, if you recruit someone into your team that's not the best person, you're damaging your own team. So I think that there's multiple angles we can take on this.
Okay. Do either of my other panelists have any views on that? Okay. Conscious that we are closing in on the hour, and it's very pleasing to see that the result of the first poll was that 83% of the people who are attending this conference believe that age diversity is part of their organisation's key values. So perhaps another poll as we look towards close, which is, has today's event changed your view on the priority of age diversity in your organisation? So if we could put that poll up. Oh, yes, it is. Thank you. And then perhaps a second question to that is, have you heard of the Age Diversity Forum's Champion Programme? I think to close, I'd like to thank the panelists for giving their time this morning, but I'd also like to very much thank the delegates who've come along and listened and asked some questions. From an Age Diversity Forum's point of view, we would be very pleased to talk to you about how we might be able to help your organisations. And if I may just close then with hope this has given you food for thought, and thank you for taking part.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.